might get kicked off if we could take our seats, please, as a panel. Right, well, welcome to the Superannuation Retirement Incomes concurrent session. Thank you very much for turning up. So today what we're going to do is we're going to address three topics with an introduction from Craig Dunn from the FSI panel. And the way this has sort of been organised is I've invited speakers in each of those three topic areas and to make a 5-minute introductory speech, after which we're going to follow by open discussion from the floor. I ask you if you get involved with it by either saying something or have a question, that you use the microphones and you push the button to register, and so we can hear you. The speakers I've got have been, basically what we've tried to do is span both academia through to practitioners, industry commentators, industry practitioners, to give us a good breadth of opinion, if you want, from various different angles. So that's basically how the session's going to run. In terms of the open discussion, I think Pauline's going to run the first session around system efficiency and in competition, more like a traditional panel, but we will have time for questions and also industry engagement, whereas I think the last two sessions are going to be more involved with open discussion from the floor. So at this point we'll move on now to introduce Craig. Craig, of course, doesn't need a lot of introduction. I thank him very much for coming here. But what I will mention what I've asked Craig to talk about, and that is specifically I'd like Craig to give us some reflections on the FSI and how they philosophically approached the superannuation and retirement incomes area. And I've particularly asked him to say what led the FSI to the conclusion that the system was actually inefficient in some way and and the competition was inadequate. Given that that's probably the most contentious proposition that appears in the whole area, how did the FSI come to that particular conclusion? Anyway, I'll leave it up to Craig to let us know his thoughts.
Great, thank you, Geoff, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me along this morning, and thank you to many of you in the audience who I know contributed very significantly to the submissions and contributions that the industry made to our inquiry, and we appreciate that. So Geoff's covered what I'm going to speak about, and I'll try and deal with those issues as briefly as I can so we can get to the more eminent speakers who are going to give you their views on what we've said. So just about the philosophy and background to the superannuation system and the way we approached it in the report, it's important to understand that this was a review of the broader financial system. The objectives of the review to understand how Australia's financial system can help promote sustainable economic growth, and importantly it was about how the financial system meets the needs of users. So obviously financial institutions and financial intermediaries are clearly very important, have very important roles to play in the system, but the primary focus was on the needs of users. And we drew the broader conclusion on the financial system that we thought that if the financial system was efficient, resilient and fair to the users of the system, then that would be a good way of achieving that broader objective of promoting economic growth. So this wasn't, as you all know, a sole focus on the superannuation system. It was looking at the superannuation system in the context of the broader financial system. And clearly, as we all know, the superannuation system is becoming much larger and much more significant as a part of the broader financial system. We also had quite a broad terms of reference, but in some ways there were restrictions or limitations on what we could look at. So the terms of reference didn't really enable us to go to the social policy settings around superannuation. And by that I mean, how does the superannuation and retirement income system fit within the welfare system, how we approach pensions, taxation and the like, although I'll come back to tax in a moment. And it also meant we weren't really able to address the issue of what is an adequate retirement income. We saw those as very much social policy settings, which were outside the ambit of what we could look at. On income tax, which I just touched on, also the terms of reference did not allow us to make any recommendations on taxation, although we did make some observations on the taxation of superannuation and more broadly in the financial system, and made some observations that the tax white paper might like to consider, and I know they'll be discussed later on in this session. Also importantly, and we're going to come to the efficiency backdrop and the recommendation we made there, but we did recognise the strengths of our system, and we did make it clear in the report that we have got, as most people would know in this room, you know, a very well-regarded system internationally. That doesn't mean, of course, however, that the system can't be improved and shouldn't be improved. Again, given the significance of the system to the broader financial system, the economy, and how funds are allocated within the economy, and of course the retirement income goal, it's pretty important that this is the best possible system that we can have as far as superannuation goes. There are a number of recommendations on superannuation, and the committee would say they're all important, as are all 44 recommendations. But one that perhaps warrants a bit of discussion before I go to the efficiency recommendation is one that goes to the recommendation around trying to get a political consensus, if you like, on what the overriding objective of our retirement income system is. And ideally, getting that enshrined in legislation and then having some sort of regular reporting mechanism that fed back to the Parliament and the broader community on how we were going on delivering against that objective. And that objective, in our opinion, was all about providing a retirement income or an income in retirement that went to substituting or supplementing the age pension. Now, that recommendation almost seems blindingly obvious, and you might argue almost too obvious to include in the report, particularly given the sophistication of our system. But I think it is timely to look back and say, what are we really trying to achieve with our superannuation system? And if we can get broad political consensus on that and across the community, then we're more likely to have stable and more effectively targeted policy settings. It also, I think, provides a really good framework to some other discussions that impact the system. So on tax, for example, I won't go into the detail there. I mean, in any tax debate, you've got to consider fairness, you've got to consider the impact on incentives or disincentives to drive improved productivity in the system, and presumably many other things. I'm not a tax expert. But if the objective of the superannuation system is to focus on retirement incomes and substituting or supplementing the age pension, and if you look at where most of the tax concessions go in the system, even putting to side the issue of fairness, if the objective is to provide retirement incomes, why would most of the tax concessions be going into that part of the community when they will clearly be able to self-provide in retirement in any case? So that's an example of how that objective, I think, can help provide a framework for a more informed discussion and debate about what we're really trying to achieve. So sorry to spend time on that, but I think that really is very important to get across. Now, coming to the issue of efficiency, which perhaps wasn't welcomed by everyone in terms of the recommendation we made, and you know, everyone will take their own view about whether we got it right or not. I just should make at the outset that just some backdrop to that recommendation very quickly. I mean, we clearly accept that it's not the sole measure in terms of understanding or assessing the effectiveness of our system. In the end, that's more got to be around what is the net returns that we're providing to members over time, given their risk profile. That's got to be the ultimate measure. But you can't ignore that efficiency is important in determining that outcome, just as other things are as well. So we're not ignoring the broader canvas and the broader objective on investment returns. And we also understand that in some cases, a higher cost base will deliver you a better net investment return, and therefore that's what trustees should adopt. We've also very much accepted that we need to give MySuper an opportunity to determine whether it's effective and whether it works. You know, there's Jeremy over here on my left, came up with some very substantial and significant recommendations, and they're really only just being implemented, and we need to give the system time to determine whether they're effective in addressing the things that Jeremy's committee came up with and we support on efficiency. And I also recognise that international comparisons are never straightforward. No system really is the same across borders, and that you have to be very careful when you look at international systems to assess our efficiency. Having said all those things, the inquiry came down with its recommendation or conclusion that the system could be more efficient and that a different approach to competition could drive that efficiency. And so how did we arrive at that conclusion? And time will only allow me to touch on these things at a very high level. Rice Warner did some very good research that showed how the scale of the industry, both in terms of its absolute size and the size of funds, had changed over the last 10 years. Their research also was very clear that the bulk of those scale benefits had not been passed back to members in terms of reduced fees. They'd gone elsewhere. Secondly, if you look at the market in superannuation, and scale is not everything, but it's quite hard to look at our market and say scale is not important. It's hard to look at a superannuation fund and say it can't benefit from scale. Yet despite that benefit that comes from scale in terms of improved efficiency and potentially greater benefits to members, we have a very fragmented market. Now, there can be a range of reasons for that, but the market doesn't seem to be taking advantage of scale, and competition doesn't seem to be driving that consolidation that would enable the market to take advantage of that scale. Even in MySuper, and I understand it's very early days, there's a very broad range in pricing. Now, I know it's only just commenced, and I know it's not a perfect market, but that broad range in price, even in some instances where the asset allocations are almost identical, suggests that maybe competition isn't driving the right outcomes just yet. We all know that it's just a fact that not all consumers are engaged in their superannuation, and there's a whole range of reasons for that, and to give the credit that's due to the industry, it's worked very hard to try and improve engagement amongst its membership. But that means they're not necessarily active participants in the system in terms of driving behaviours that might drive down price and improve efficiency. We also have agency risk in the system, and you can touch on that in a range of different areas, but we know, given the nature of our system in Australia, certainly the default market, that many employers are charged with making a decision on behalf of their employees. Now, I'm sure, my experience is, employers want to do the right thing by their employees, but they don't necessarily have the time or the capabilities or the technical expertise to make judgments in that area. Superannuation is not their core business. And so there's an agency effect there as well. And then finally, if you think about a market in superannuation or an element of the default fund market where you'd argue competition seems to be pretty intense, that would appear to be amongst the large employers in our market. And the evidence, certainly from the committee's perspective, was in that market there has been substantial reductions in pricing and in fees, well beyond many other parts of the default market, and there's been no observable reduction in the quality of the outcomes, despite those reduced fees. So there's a suggestion that maybe there's an opportunity to make that more broadly effective, if you like, or impact the whole parts of the default market. And finally, I just say the recommendations in this area are very much centred on the default fund market. Now, in that market, as we know, we've got people that are being compelled to save. They don't have a choice, they're being compelled to save, and many of them, for whatever reason, are not making an active choice in how they do that. They're relying on a default. So, I mean, the report makes the statement or the view, and I think Jeremy probably reached a similar conclusion, he might like to comment on this later, there's almost a higher standard here to make sure that they are getting efficient outcomes because they're being compelled to save and they're not making active choices around how they save. So that's really what drove our thinking around efficiency. So whether you agree or disagree with those findings, I hope that's given you a bit better insight to our thinking, and certainly we'll have more discussion on that now, and I'm sure there'll be some opinions that disagree with what I've said. But I just conclude with this. We have every right to be very proud of the system we have in Australia and how it stacks up internationally. That doesn't mean it shouldn't and can't be better. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Many friends in the room, I welcome you all. So to really leverage off what Craig was saying, the first discussion is about system efficiency and competition. And yes, scale is part of that, active versus passive, whether there'd ever be a demand side, particularly in the default market. And my three very capable panel members will be starting that discussion for you to contribute. But what I would say is this: as we have started to have this debate, and as the report came out, there has been a lot of people that have agreed, a lot of people that have not agreed. The bottom line is the community and our major stakeholders are saying the industry is too expensive. The industry does not take advantage of scale, and we're not sure the industry is doing the best thing by fund members. So what we need to do as an industry is to be able to show with very much the same language and with the right proof that we are. Put our own measures up and say this is how we will measure our own performance, and that way we can be more accountable and transparent. Our first panel speaker is known to many of you, Warren Chant.
Thank you, Pauline, and good morning, everybody. At our firm, we don't agree with the FSI that fees are too high and that a way to fix that is to have a tender system run by Treasury. But before I explain our reasons for that, I'd just like to make two observations about the industry that I think will help you to better analyse it. In a sense, you could say there are two parts to the industry. There's choice and there's MySuper, so default. And fees in choice are higher than fees in MySuper. But people who go to choice go there by choice. They choose to pay higher fees for reasons of their own. When we're looking at MySuper, which is the vast majority of Australians, right, that is a different kettle of fish. When we read, so if you do analysis that combines the two, if you say fees across the industry, then I think you're doing the MySuper people and most Australians a disservice. What we should be concentrating on is just the fees of MySuper. Most Australians are in a MySuper account. The second thing is, and it's a really important point to note, and I don't think too many academics get this point, but every member of a MySuper fund is a wholesale investor. Whether you've got $100, $1,000, $10,000, etc., you get the benefit of scale of that fund. Now, there'll be many people in this room this morning who are a member of UniSuper. And I dare say that there wouldn't be many of you where your account balance is currently over $250,000. For many of you, it will be substantially less than that. But as a member of UniSuper, you're getting the benefit of scale of more than $40 billion. And so there's a lot of analysis done in the market that talks about retail investors. There are any number of studies done around the world over the last 3 or 4 decades that look at passive versus active. And essentially, what they do is they look at the retail market. And unsurprisingly, basically what we find is that retail investors around the world, retail investors being people with a relatively small amount of money, around the world, most of them would be better off in a passive investment rather than an active investment. And that's because they're paying an awful lot for the privilege to be with an active manager. Whatever alpha might be generated is eaten up in the extra fees. But if you've got $10,000 as a retail investor, that's the world that you face. If you've got $10,000 in a MySuper product, you don't face that world. What you face, if you're a member of UniSuper, is you're getting the benefit of over $40 billion worth of scale. And so when we're sort of analysing, when the academics around this country are analysing superannuation, they have to understand the uniqueness in that small investors in superannuation are wholesale investors. Basically, the FSI is saying that fees are too high because there's not enough competition, and there's not enough competition because consumers are not engaged with their super. So there's not enough price-driven competition. And we don't think that that's actually a true statement in that the majority of people are disengaged. But you don't need them to be engaged to have competition. And in this overhead, I'm trying to give you some sense of why we would say that. So what you can see here, if you look on the left, we're saying, just above the red line in the middle there, for all those funds with assets of more than 5 billion, there are actually 29 MySuper products. And they represent almost 80% of total assets under management. And indeed, they represent almost 75% of all members. So we're saying the top 30 funds, that's a lot of funds to generate competition. These funds compete with one another vigorously. We're not talking about 4 banks. Right? We're talking about 30 funds with more than 5 billion in assets. And even if you said 5 billion is not that big, if you go one row up and we say there are 16 funds with assets of more than 10 billion, and those 16 funds represent almost 2/3 of FUM and over 60% of total membership. So what we're saying is the fact that consumers aren't in there driving competition. The funds themselves are driving competition. And if you look at the second last line there, by the way, what we've done here is we've said at June last year, if we assumed all the ADAs were transferred over to MySuper, right, we end up with almost 600 billion in MySuper, which is a significant part of our entire system. And that represents about 18 million members. It's not really members, it's the number of accounts, but for simplicity, we say members. So my point here is that the funds themselves are rigorously engaged in competition. What I don't have on this overhead is some numbers. We've just looked at the 16 largest products. So we say there is not only competition amongst the funds, but there's enormous competition amongst the service providers. So if we take those 16 largest funds, it turns out that for Australian shares, there are 60 managers across those 16 funds, 60 managers. And collectively, they have 150 mandates. So there are 150 spots to fill for those 16 funds. And in international shares, there are 75 managers, and they fill 160 spots. So for Australian shares and international shares, for those 16 funds, all right, there are, if my maths is right, 135 managers. And if we extend that across all of the asset sectors, we haven't actually done the analysis, but it's easy to say that it would be at least double that. So we're talking about 270. Let's round it up to, I've got 2 minutes left. Let's round it up to 300. So those 16 funds are using 300 managers. But the pool of managers that are competing is probably 3 times that. If we looked at the higher managers of the consultants, for those 300, there would probably be a pool of 900. So what we're saying is that drives enormous competition in our industry. I'd just like to comment briefly on Chile. The Grattan Institute came out with a report last year talking a great deal about Chile, and they said that the fees in the Chile default system were 1/3 of the fees in the average MySuper product in Australia. And the Financial Services Council, when that happened, the Financial Services Council asked us to do some research on Chile, which we did, which I must say was very difficult because everyone in Chile speaks Spanish and everything is written in Spanish. And you have to phone them about 12 o'clock at night to sort of talk to them in the morning. But nevertheless, it was an interesting exercise, and what we found was the Grattan Institute made a mistake, a very simple mistake. When they were looking at the fees in Chile, all they were looking at was the administration fees. When they compared that with Australia, they looked at the administration fees plus the investment fees. And we know in Australia that administration fees represent about 1/3 of our total fees, and investment fees represent about 2/3. So the comparison wasn't fair. When we realised this, we worked closely with the Grattan Institute for them to understand what we were doing and to check our numbers, and we worked very closely with them, and in the end they realised they had made a mistake. 30 seconds. In Chile, where they have a tender system, they had a tender system because they only have 4 funds, or they only had 5 funds, 4 large ones and 1 little one. And they wanted to introduce more competition. After 5 years, they've now got 1 more fund. We don't have 6 funds We have 30 funds that have 5 billion or more. We have a totally different environment. To us, it just doesn't seem sensible to have a tender system. If I can just show you one more overhead. What we're showing here is we're saying for all of those funds with 5 billion or more of assets, 29 of them, the weighted average fee, total fee, so admin and investments, is 90 basis points. And if we looked at all of those funds with assets of more than 10 billion, their weighted average fee is 86 basis points. And if we look at those funds where their assets are less than 5 billion, it's 105 basis points. And you can see to the right the ranges, so 75% of funds fall within those ranges. We just can't see, given the environment that we have, the competitiveness of the funds, the competitiveness of the service providers, why anyone would think that those fees aren't reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Warren. Let's give him a clap. Getting Warren, and it was 8 minutes to 8 minutes. I think it's a great feat, so thanks, Warren. I'd now like to introduce Scott Hartley, the CEO of Sunsuper.
Thanks, Pauline. Can everyone hear me? No. Does that work? It's working now. Thanks. Okay, so in relation to efficiency and competition, I agree with Warren that the default industry is not broken or helped by simplistic observations about fair comparisons with other countries. But I believe as an industry we can do better. The FSI report has put us on notice, and we owe it to the people not in this room, the millions of Australians whose money we manage, who are counting on us and trusting us to deliver value for money and to maximise the retirement outcomes. We focus the efficiency debate in the default system on MySuper products, as Warren suggested. There are 3 areas where I think the industry can do better. First, in the area of investment fees, the Australian industry has a strong bias towards active management that is not supported by the performance outcomes achieved. Warren has rightly pointed out, although you didn't get to that slide, but there is a slide in Warren's deck that talks about the performance of the top 10 profit for member funds, and it shows that half the members, or half the accounts are covered by these funds and that they've performed above the diversified index. However, over the last 15 years, the median balance performance over rolling 10 years has basically delivered, after tax and fees, balanced index fund performance, give or take 10 basis points. So despite average fees of just over 60 basis points and over 80% of active management effort, we have added no value versus the index that could have cost members about 10 basis points. Therefore, we have not delivered value for money. I strongly agree that active management can and does add value across and within some elements of our portfolios, but our bias has meant that our positive alpha generated in those areas has been offset by negative alpha fees and profit margins. For example, Australian super funds have been spectacularly bad, on average, in active management of global equities, and there is no more than a handful of funds who've consistently outperformed the global equities benchmarks on a rolling 5-year basis over 15 years, and on average have lost about 50 basis points of alpha. Therefore, I think fund CEOs, CIOs and trustees need to be more thoughtful about where they have confidence that they can add value in their portfolios and value for fees. The second area of inefficiency is market fragmentation. The default super business cycle is mature, the industry is mature and very fragmented, as Craig pointed out. The company with the largest market share is AMP with 5%, and there are over 150 other default funds competing for market share. Economies of scale do exist, and if the industry consolidated to, say, a dozen funds overall, aggregate default fees should be expected to reduce by around 10 basis points against the average of about 90 basis points that Warren put up. Mostly this economy of scale exists in operations, but some economies exist in large-scale investment operations as well. The third area of inefficiency is the cross-subsidisation within retail default funds. Retail MySupers are priced high to allow for deep, unprofitable and unjustifiable discounts to large corporate clients. Retail MySuper prices are typically around 120 to 140 basis points, and the retailers offer discounts for very large employers of up to 60 to 70 basis points. This discount does not equate to reduced costs of serving this large group of members. The retailers do this to acquire large groups at a loss and more than make up for their loss via smaller employers or when members leave their employer and end up in the general division of the MySuper division at the rack rate, at the top price. Addressing this inequity would see a reduction in fees in that part of the industry in the order of 20 to 30 basis points, assuming that these retailers wanted to remain competitive in that segment, in the default segment. In summary, there's potential for fee reductions of somewhere between 20 and 30 basis points are conceivable. I agree with Warren that most funds seek to position their fees competitively. Well, actually, you didn't get to speak to competition either, but I prepared this earlier. But so actually, Craig spoke to it, and Warren did speak to it, that fees are positioned by funds competitively. So they look at the industry and they look at the competing funds and they try to set a competitive fee. But intense competition only really resides in that large corporate space in the market for corporate superannuation accounts. And there are barriers to entry or barriers to competition in super, and these two barriers are the modern awards process, which nominates defaults, and approved product lists of the integrated product providers. So these two barriers in the industry, with the right competitive settings, if they were opened up to more competition with the right competitive settings, would benefit Australian consumers. The first one, the modern awards, obviously Sun Super benefits from modern awards, I would agree that, but I would also agree that the competition that is fair and in the best interests of members should be beneficial to Australian consumers. Fair is really about that there must be a level playing field between standalone superannuation funds and wealth managers like AMP and bank-owned super funds. Best interest, in particular, fund selection must be guided by members' best interests and not inducements directly or indirectly offered to employers around the banking arrangements. There needs to be a quality filter. I mean, not all MySupers are the same. As again Craig pointed out, there's a range of 135 basis points in price between them. That is a quality element. It's not the whole argument, but it's certainly part of it. And so this range suggests, well, tells you that MySuper is not a quality mark. It is a regulatory product structure. And so you can't simply say, because MySuper, if something's been accredited MySuper, that is a quality product. So that's probably, the other aspect of competitive barriers are the approved product lists of the integrated players. Quality MySupers should be on approved product lists of the integrated players to ensure that in-house products, and ASIC probably needs to ensure that in-house products aren't favoured ahead of quality external funds. And this, by the way, is necessary for the Insto-aligned planners to deliver on the best interest duty. So that's really what I want to cover. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Well, we've heard some interesting things already. Certainly active versus passive. I hope that doesn't mean everybody invests in cash and bonds, but we can go to that. I used to be in charge of a fund manager where it was active-passive. I think we need to change the language. I think there are some issues with competition. Research from Weiss Warner has shown that discretionary costs have gone up 24% because of competition. So it's a complex debate. And to add to the debate, Scott Donald.
Thank you, Pauline. I'll try not to add to the complexity then. As Pauline and Geoff know, I've had real trouble working out what I was going to say today because I had some idea of what my colleagues would say. So I decided I wanted to talk to you about a major scandal that is affecting all working Australians. We pay too much. It affects our retirement. And it's this. We pay too much for our cars. This morning I went and got this magazine and I downloaded from the back the prices of all the cars that we have. And you'll be offended, deeply offended to know, on average we pay $90,000 for a car. Of course that's nonsense. All I did was I took the list price and I put it in a spreadsheet and I took an average. The median's about 40, so don't worry if you spent less than that. That's a piece of analysis that's an affront to your intelligence, and it was intended to be, because the FSI's analysis of this similarly was an affront to our intelligence. Notwithstanding the mistakes that identified by my colleagues earlier, the idea that we can take these list prices and ignore all the complexity, and that we can not look into them any more carefully, is terrible. We know that people don't pay the list price for cars. We know there are different specs within each model. We know that more people buy Toyotas than buy Lamborghinis, for goodness sakes. Well, maybe not in this room, but mostly. We know that people exercise choice. All of these things are known. Now, I don't know what was discussed in the inner workings of the review, and I'm sure it was much more sophisticated than what came out in the report. But for the report to deliver the conclusion it delivered was outrageous. It really was. Absolutely unacceptable. The idea that in one place you can say we don't know what the objective of superannuation is, and then next to it say, oh, but it's inefficient. How do you gauge inefficiency if you don't know what the objective is? This is just, I find it very difficult to talk about this without getting a little bit excited, so apologies for that. So there's lots of other areas where there are inconsistencies. For instance, in one place we talk about the need to have independent directors, which is an idea that has, I think, something to commend. Why should we do that? Because it'll improve governance. If you go back and have a look at the funds that are generating the high fees, they're the ones that have and are claiming independent directors. There is no reconciliation of those two inconsistent observations. There might be a reconciliation possible, but there's nothing in the report. So I can draw one of a couple of conclusions after 25 years of working in this industry. Either we let people get away with these sorts of analyses, and Jim Menifee, to his credit, has personally apologised to me, and it sounds like to some of my colleagues here, for what they wrote. He hasn't done it publicly. But either we're stupid, either we don't understand what we're looking at, and I don't think that's true. I think we have two problems. And this, I think, we need to address before we can actually get the debate to the next level. The first, and this I do agree with the report, is the politicisation of the industry and the way in which people line up in one of two camps. It used to be three camps, but the corporate funds are now more or less gone, but one of two camps, and are cheered on for saying things that are completely unsupportable but very parochial. Until we get away from that, we are going to struggle to have any policy debate in which we can get some kind of reason, some kind of engagement, some kind of sensible outcome. Because most of the stuff that we've all talked about, we all know. We can't get past it. And the second, and I'll finish in a moment because it must be just about time, is that we have an emphasis, a correct emphasis, on evidence-based policy formulation. That makes perfect sense unless you're talking about the future. You can't rely purely on evidence. You can't just look to other markets and go, oh, look, that's what they're doing, we'll just take their numbers. Because we have to engage in something that academics and others call counterfactuals. What if things were different? And that doesn't necessarily mean that there may not be any data to support that. You know, when Cooper Review was thinking about My Super, we didn't actually have numbers that could prove that this was actually going to be the right thing to do. There was a small leap of faith in some of that. You had to use qualitative analysis. You had to think about how market dynamics and other things might work. So we need to be, apart from depoliticising, we also need to be comfortable with forms of analysis that are not supported by the sort of silly data that I can produce in 20 minutes with a spreadsheet out of the back of a magazine, or by downloading Michael or somebody else's data. I have to say I think it's important that we use data. It's amazing. This is the third time in a row that I've agreed with Warren at a conference. This is a tremendous development for both of us. But data is important, but we have to find ways to get past that because the future we don't have the data on the future yet. We have to start to think about how things might adapt, and it's not a linear process. So we have to be courageous, to use Sir Humphrey Appleby. I've tried to be provocative, which is what I was asked to do, and I'm happy to take comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, for the record, I have asked Craig if he wants a wider reply to what Scott said, but he's going to hold his powder for the time being. So that gives you an opportunity. It is a complex debate. Let's try and frame it, because we don't have much time left, around the defaults. But I do open it up now for questions and comments. Who'd like to start? All right, I have one. How lucky. I do want to go back to the active versus passive debate because I think it's important that we clarify that. And there's been a lot of work done on the efficiencies of portfolios. and the way tax is managed. And Charles Watson, for example, said that there were many portfolios that could save up to 30 to 40 basis points by actually being more efficient in the way that they manage their portfolio, including tax. We know that over the longer term, when you compare the return on bonds and equities, equities clearly are the better performer. So it has to be a diversified portfolio. That's the way I've always thought. Certainly in a beta portfolio, it's about really making sure you're actively making it diversified without doing, if you like, unvalue-adding activity. But I'd just like to open that debate, particularly as we look at post-retirement. Any of the panel members just want to comment on that? Is this about putting everything in cash? Going passive? So one wants to go backwards on the slides. You want go back? Go back.
Yeah, okay.
Beautiful.
So this
You'll
is
have to press
okay. Sorry. So this overhead I didn't get to before, and I like it because if you look at it, you actually learn a great deal from it. So here we've got the 10 largest funds at June last year, and we've got their fees at their investment fees at December this year. And what we've put in here, we talk a lot about you pay what you get for. So if you invest a lot more in unlisted assets, you expect your fees to be higher. And if you invest a lot more in passive management, you expect your fees to be lower. And so if we look there, just at the very top, or see Q Super has 58% of its assets managed passively. And you can see its fees are quite low compared to the other funds. And you can see the same with First State Super. It's got 27% of its assets invested passively, and its total fee is 42 basis points. And if you look at the top, you can see Australian Super is about 60 basis points, but as you go down the bottom, you see we're sort of talking 70 to 80 basis points. Now, all of these funds are either top quartile or second quartile performers. Just flick over two more overheads, please.
Two more overheads. On two.
One more.
One more. Thank you.
What? No, sort of forward then. Forward.
The other way?
Forward. Yep. Woo. So we put in a submission to the FSI. We basically, you hear a lot of commentators say higher fees paid to managers doesn't necessarily result in better performance. And what we were trying to show here was that for those 10 funds, we're saying they tend to pay higher fees, but they tend to have the best performance. And so what we're saying is what's applicable in the retail market isn't necessarily applicable in the wholesale market. And remember what I said, one of my very first comments was, you have to remember that every member in a MySuper product is a wholesale investor. So here what we did, you can see a passive benchmark there, and actually that's a Vanguard, it's a Vanguard product. And so over 15 years, you can see that the median of these 10 largest funds outperformed Vanguard by 80 basis points, and that's after taking into account the difference in fees. And over 10 years, it was 40 basis points, and over 5 years, it was 20. And in the more recent periods, we've got the impact of the GSC, and listed markets have performed very well, and so these funds haven't quite outperformed their retail competitors, as we might see. But this, what we were trying to get at here was to try to dispel the notion that high-paying fees, this is true in the retail market, but high-paying fee products don't necessarily lead to good performance. We think that's true in the retail market. But in the wholesale market, we don't think that's right. Because what we have with these funds is we have a team of experts who are trying to find the best managers. And not only that, the price they're paying is significantly less than what a retail investor is paying in the retail market. So we just wanted to show here that we think there's enough evidence to really, really question. The Grattan Institute, for example, many commentators, so Vanguard's out there at the moment, sort of saying we should have much more passive management. But our concern is that we have a group of funds in this country, the not-for-profit funds, the industry funds in particular, who have served Australians incredibly well. And we don't want to see that, what's the term? The goose that laid the golden egg, we don't want to see the goose killed. Right? That's what we're fighting for. So what we're saying is that to the academics in this room, you really have to understand the industry before you can apply your analytical skills. And this is a really good picture that just sort of says, think about whether, when you're analysing the superannuation market, taking your knowledge of what happens in the retail market, is it relevant? We don't think it is.
Thanks, Warren. Questions, comments? Look, I do want to pose... thank you.
I just have one comment with the three speakers and also the FSI. Understanding the industry, the biggest segments of the industry is self-managed super funds, and that is the natural competitor when it comes to fees. Now, there are segments of people with only $25,000 in their super funds, 10% of those, and they're clearly inefficient themselves, but it gives people the opportunity to actually go and do it themselves if they're worried about fees, and then that lead to the next part of the equation, performance. And you spoke about that adequately, and then with the, you've got the large APRA funds, you've got natural divisions there between not-for-profit, retail, and the like. So, but self-managed super funds definitely have to be in the equation here when you're talking about competition in respect to fees in the superannuation industry. And there was a big shift there just post-GFC, where it became the largest segment of the whole superannuation industry, and it's still to this day.
Yeah, it still has the most amount of money, but I think one of the conversations that is part of this broader conversation, and I'll come to you, Jeremy, is the demand side. So often the question is, why have people gone to self-managed funds? It is actually choice of moving from a pooled vehicle, or is it another motivation? Jeremy?
Look, just a very quick observation about self-managed funds. I mean, I'm on the record as being a supporter, but on the question of performance, that industry is driving without a dashboard. They can't do numbers like Warren's done, the whole standards and science of getting a set of statutory accounts in your self-managed fund, stripping out all the right cash flows and doing that sort of stuff. Unless you're on some very glamorous software package, you have no idea what's going on.
Thank you. Other comments? Scott?
Perhaps I could make a slightly more moderate comment around competition, because CIFR actually funded some research that some colleagues and I did looking at the structure of the industry, which we shared with the FSI. One of the perverse things or strange things that comes out is that if you look at the structure of the industry, there are a large number of funds, but there are also a variety of other service providers on whom they rely very, very heavily. And the suggestion that somehow the number of entities is related to competition is a very dangerous one, because what we actually find is those pockets that we typically think of as being less competitive actually have the most participants. And areas such as administration and some others, where there's maybe only a handful of players, are actually very, very tightly priced. And what that's actually led to us going back to CIFR, and they've actually now funded some research looking at competition in this decentralised system, because the relationship between price to the consumer and competition and the number of players is much, much more complex than you might think in a bank where there might be, or some other product space where there might only be a few providers. So when we start talking about competition, saying is there or isn't there, when you look down, there are parts where it's over-competitive in a sense. There's no return on capital for some of the players.
Look, I would agree with that, and certainly from an ASFA point of view, we see new players coming into the industry. And for the first time in a number of years, we're starting to see potential disruptors. So small, very agile retail players, for example, that have leveraged off scale in terms of their administration and their investment, and are offering total fee products under 50 basis points, and I mean way under 50 basis points. We did talk about legacy products before. We know they're a drag on the system of about 20 basis points, but I do feel some of these new players and the leverage into new technology will really chase up that competition. And with that, unless there's one final comment from the broader audience, I'd like to close this session. Thank you.
I'd just like to make a comment, Pauline. Karen from AIST. I think carving out choice, and I take Warren's point that those members can make a choice, but it's still a substantial amount of money in that side of the sector. So I think saying that the efficiency in the MySuper space needs to be looked at differently to choice, it still impacts on adequacy of savings, sustainability of the system, so that's just a comment.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Pauline and the panellists. We're now going to move on to CIPRs, which sounds, as Jeremy was pointing out, sounds a lot like CIFR, but anyway, let's move on. In terms of this particular issue, what the FSI did, in my interpretation, is to say that we needed some sort of connection to the MySuper default, transitioning into retirement, even though they were reluctant to use the term default. And I think that was very much welcome. And part of what I'm going to say as opening comments is that myself and Scott and a few other researchers interviewed some 28 executives and 20 funds earlier this year on the design of their MySuper. And one of the common complaints we got was that MySuper ended at retirement. And there was a clear desire from within the industry to have a transition. And I think that the FSI has picked up on this and has run with this as being a very positive thing, is much welcomed by the industry. It's basically opening the door for design of these products. But the really interesting issue is that very much as Peter Mason was saying this morning, it just said this is an area we need to look at. And it left it very much open about how it would be implemented. So, and just reading out, quoting from page 117 of the FSI report, what was it asking for in terms of CIPRs? And paraphrasing it, features should include regular and stable income stream, longevity risk management and flexibility. Their design could vary with members' known characteristics, such as the size of superannuation benefits, and take account of the possibility of a cognitive impairment at older ages. I think that comes from Hazel's research. A combination of underlying products would be required, and regulatory impediments need to be improved. Now, I read two things in that series of statements. One is they're asking the industry to provide longevity insurance. The second thing it was asking for was some form of tailoring, the funds to decide what was the best product for members, perhaps with a suite of products, and to mix them together. And again, there's two problems with this. One is longevity insurance has always been a difficult problem to handle by private providers because pooling has been very difficult. So one of the first questions I've challenged our panel with is how can funds deal with longevity insurance from a private perspective when perhaps the natural provider of longevity pooling is the government? The second thing is, how do you effectively tailor? And I go back to the interviews that we did with fund managers. Quite often, a lot of them were telling us that we'd like to tailor better to our members, but the problem is we don't know enough about them. Now, that was in regard to accumulation, but when you move into the retirement phase, the idea of tailoring becomes a lot more important and a lot bigger hurdle to overcome. You have the situation of your member, not only in terms of their balance size and their age, which you may know, but you have whether they got outside superannuation, does it give them access to the pension, do they have a bequest motive, what's their risk aversion, are they worried about their health and their longevity? I could go on, the list is very long. So hence comes the second question. If you're going to ask the industry to choose a product, how are they going to do that in practice? And what impediments are there? So that with that background, that's the logic behind those two questions. It's about implementation, and I'll introduce Jeremy, again, who needs no introduction, and we'll hear what he's got to say on the matter.
Thanks, Geoff. Very briefly, because we've only got 5 minutes. I will say just one thing off the back of Geoff's comments. Of course, MySuper wasn't intended to stop at the end of accumulation, but I think it's fair to say that the industry just wasn't ready for the change, and let's hope it's ready this time around. So when I get home tonight, my wife will, as spouses often do, say, "Well, what did you do today, darling?" And I'll say I went to CIFR and talked about CIPRs, and she'll say, superannuation really is a marvellous industry, isn't it? Now look, I'm going to concentrate on just one aspect of CIPRs. I'm assuming you've all read and reread Recommendation 11, so I'm not going to take you through what it is, but I'm going to go to one aspect of making these things work. And let me first say that I think there's only upside in introducing a CIPR. The ultimate choice product. I teased Kevin Davis yesterday by saying that I thought there was sort of origami-like care in Recommendation 11 to make sure that it wasn't a default product. It was a choice product. So this will not prevent super funds from having other retirement solutions. It's not going to be, it's really not like MySuper. I think in time this origami will be sandpapered away to really crunch two metaphors together really, really badly, and it will probably effectively be a default. But the issue I wanted to talk about today was really, all of these things in retirement always have a triangle, and the triangle was flexibility, risk management, longevity risk, etc., and sort of regular and high income on the other point of the triangle. And the point is that you can't have all together. So the triangle pulls it against each other. So there's no world where you can have super high income, have all the risks managed, and total flexibility. You know, that's just the sort of magic pudding tooth fairy superannuation that doesn't exist. So how do you deal with the tension of the triangle sort of pulling at itself? And so there has to be some sort of qualitative assessment around what a CIPR is. Otherwise, I could come and say, well, look, I've looked at the triangle, I've read Recommendation 11, I'm going to go out and create superannuation, retirement product, 100% equities, totally flexible, deals with longevity risk, deals with inflation risk, high income, fantastic. Now, if that's the world that CIPRs, if that's what we end up with CIPR, that's a nothing, because there's no impact. The industry will be able to do whatever it likes on all the existing nostrums, and we won't, all this massive effort that we've gone into in the retirement income space will amount to nothing. So somebody's got to make some qualitative assessments around, does this product actually seriously engage with what we're trying to do here? My suggestion is that person is APRA, using its new much fought for standards-making power, and with lots and lots of consultative processes. This is not going to be an easy thing, but somebody has to sort of qualitatively rate CIPRs. Now, I'm suggesting a sort of balanced scorecard approach. There's a lot of work to be done here, but just how well do we think it's going to do the longevity risk management? Let's have a look at this income. Is it volatile? So you would get a high rating for high income, but if that came with attendant volatility around the retirement income, you'd get some sort of mark that marked you down. So this is qualitative stuff. I just can't see a way that CIPRs are going to make a difference out there unless somebody's making some qualitative decisions around these products. Now, I'm not saying that the regulators should say, well, you're not allowed to have that product. So the idea would be is that it's sort of normative. That the scoring system would be informative for consumers. There'd be a normative nudge for funds to sort of make sure they didn't get a ferociously low rating. But a fund would be quite free to have a low rating CIPR, and indeed there may be good reasons for people to be in a low rating CIPR. They may have wealth elsewhere, they maybe have a whole different risk asset appetite and so on. But there are some essential kind of truths in all this. For example, that it is just a fact that asset allocation alone, an investment strategy, does not deal with longevity risk unless you've got mountainous wealth. For the average person, you can't just come up with an asset allocation proposition, i.e. my silly example of 100% equities, and say longevity risk dealt with. That is just not true. Similarly, high returns typically are going to come with high volatility. That's simply a truth. And also, we need to think about sequencing risk and inflation. These are sort of serious and fairly mundane issues. But if CIFR is going to make a difference, if CIFR is going to be impactful, somebody's got to make a call on these strategies. So it operates as a nudge. it's normative. You know, maybe super products come out with a star rating, like when you buy a fridge, you know, is this a 4-star, 5-star, that kind of thing. It has to allow innovation, so this is not some sort of heavy-handed, you know, refrigeration, if you like, of the system. It's got to allow all sorts of things to be done. But if we had a sort of rating system driven by APRA, lots of consultation, you know, this great idea that we must have, and is a no-brainer, I think in time will be effective. So the idea is that it's a nudge. It's normative rather than necessarily prescriptive. I can't see a world where the government's going to, in fine detail and in legislation, say you've got to have all these things, and if you don't, that's not a super. So that's they're my opening remarks.